everyone, and welcome to today's event. Before we begin today's event, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm broadcasting, the Gubbi Gubbi people and the Turrbal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Collectively, we stand in footsteps millennia old. Wherever you're joining from today, please join me in acknowledging the elders and traditional custodians of all the places represented here today, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land. We humbly thank them for their generosity and wisdom and pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for the fourth event in our series, Reclaiming the Future, co-hosted by RSA Oceania and the RSA Sustainability Network. In this series, we've been looking at how we can nurture our ability to think long and create a culture of intergenerational and planetary responsibility. In our last 3 sessions, we've explored what it means to be a good ancestor and pathways to achieve intergenerational justice through legislation and by embracing more participatory and inclusive forms of democracy. We've also looked closely at the concept of time itself, particularly how time is connected to place and how this colours our approach to the long term. With Norm Sheehan and Alana Marsh, we talked about how our view of the long term is shaped by relationships, our relationships with the land and with each other, and the impact each action can have on other interrelated parts of Earth's system, extending across space and time. And in this session, we're going to bring those threads together to explore how our vision of the future is framed by the narratives that shape our society and ascribe value to certain futures. We're also going to look at how futures thinking and design can disrupt this and provide a space for speculation, learnings, and long-term visioning. And joining us to discuss this rich topic is our wonderful panel of experts.
Dr. Licho López and Gioconda Coello, who are the co-editors of the book Indigenous Futures and Learnings Taking Place, Futures and Foresight expert Victoria Ward, and Dr. Ollie Kotsaftis, a post-disciplinary designer and co-founder of Speculative Futures Melbourne. To start us off today, we have Licho and Gioconda.
Dr. Licho López is Caribbean, queer, and of Abiayala. She lives as an uninvited person on Wurundjeri country. Licho's scholarship moves through the geographies of continental Africa, Europe, the US, and Australia, and is located at the intersection of curriculum studies, Indigenous and Black studies in education, and Afro-diasporas and youth studies in the digital. She is the author of a number of works, including The Making of Indigeneity, Curriculum History and the Limits of Diversity, as well as Indigenous Futures and Learnings Taking Place, which is an incredible book, and I really recommend everybody read it. Her co-editor for this book is Gioconda Coello. Gio is a doctoral candidate from Ecuador in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research is interdisciplinary and looks at the history of ideas in education and their relation to the politics of being, Indigenous, Brown, and Black lives, and environmental education and religion in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And I know it's really, really early for Gio, so I'm really, really grateful that she could be here. But welcome to you both.
Thank you. Are you there, Licho?
I am. Hello. Buenas noches, buenas tardes, buenos días. This video is from a few days ago, and it is a site of a water geography. The Yarra River banks. The Yarra reminds me of the Sinú River, my country. These more than human creatures are Black country, Wurundjeri. They bring me joy, black and fluffy joy. I am an uninvited guest in this beautiful Wurundjeri country. I acknowledge the care that the Kulin Nation has given these lands to make these a habitable geography for these flying foxes, and for all of us who are also cared for by country.
Buenos días and buenas noches from here to everyone. And as thank you for the invitation, I also want to acknowledge and pay respect to Tumbaco and Quito, and to the ancestors and spirits that protect these lands, which make it possible for me to be here and sustain my life. We begin with some interrogations and end with the story. I will start and then Licho will meet us at the end with the story. In our work regarding futures, the anticipation of future and time in education has been one of resisting the singularity of future. Particularly, we resist the short-term or long-term imaginations of future, where indigenous and Afro-diasporic existences are not flourishing in their own terms. In this sense, the singularity of chronological time is part of the epistemology, which anticipates the future only to manage it and intervene the course of history in a way that preserves inequality and discrimination. As thinkers of education, whose work is more product than academy, we engage with the problems that emerge because time orders education in a fundamental way. Time in education affects people beyond school calendars and testing schedules because education is meant as a way to change the person and equip it for times to come. That kind of time regime plans or anticipates people into entanglements of values to face the uncertainties and fear hopes of societies. In this regard, futures in education intend to make of students future citizens, actors who reproduce society and, as Ben Anderson would say, ensure the future of the kind of life that is normalized and valued within that society. In a world where power asymmetry and coloniality have shaped what societies value, it becomes necessary to question what lives and knowledges are being imagined as part of the future. Our particular concern in this regard is to what extent do Indigenous and Black peoples have freedoms to story themselves into futures? Is education instrumentalized to overdetermine the future of people by suffocating the languages, cultural values, and ways of living that do not match a homogeneous nationalized identity? Our book, Indigenous Futures and Learnings Taking Place, raises these questions and also insists that thinking about the future, imagining it, and anticipating it does not need to be determined, as Sarah Amsler and Carrie Fraser put it, by reducing risks to the moral expectations of some and, quote, the instrumentalizing of life for another's power and profit, end quote. We think with Aymara scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicangi to see the anticipation of future as, quote, a principle of hope, end quote, where Indigenous and Black knowledges, dreamings, and stories offer other ways futures where all lives are respected and celebrated. Let us ground these interrogations here in Ecuador, where I live and work. In the last decade, the government insisted in promoting buen vivir, or good living for all, based in theory on Quechua indigenous knowledges. However, rather than respecting Indigenous people's own story of what it means to live well, the government bureaucratized the story of good living, enforcing knowledge and ways of engaging with society that complied with development goals. On the other hand, stories by Quechua elders about living well, and here I mean living well, not wellness and a kind of good living that goes beyond all these bureaucratizing notions and sort of captured notions by the government of what good life means, right? So the stories by Quechua elders about good living, about living well, are more about how the presences of land and people and the more than human people collectively produce the future and make good living possible. For example, Belhikadawa, a Quechua pottery master, asserted that to have good living in the future, people needed to learn at school, learn the stories elders tell about how to plant, how to read the stars, how to interpret dreams, and also learn to walk in the forest to know how to not disturb the trees and the spirits of the land. Knowledge for creating a good future was collaborative between school teachers, forests, and spirits, and thus not singular in any regard. Other stories not only challenge the knowledge for the future, but the very conception of future. For example, Pedro Andy talked about how the forest is the home of the people from the past. And these people are the trees, animals, the spirits, dead, who are often overlapping and unstable categories. As Pedro asserted, quote, when we die, we become part of the forest, end quote. And forest people and people of the past, quote, come to visit us in our dreams, for example, to cure us if we're sick, end quote. In this story, future is the space where past comes in to heal the present.
Now, to the story. In this present, which is also the future, in the following fictive story, there is a virus, COVID-19, that remains an open portal for the making of other stories. I wrote the story I'm about to share with you at the beginning of the pandemic, in the year 2020. And it is inspired by Munanjali and South Sea Islander woman, Chelsea Watego's dear ancestor, and two of my own Caribbean ancestors, Gabo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and my grandmother, whose voice is the voice of the story. The speculations in the story draw from Maria Jacinta Shonriquiac, a Mayan thinker of Guatemala, whose work appears in our book, Indigenous Futures and Learnings Taking Place. Maria Jacinta writes about planes of existence, multiple planes of existence beyond the human. The story plays with time and temporalities, suspending colonial time as an investment in the imagination of other futures forming. As I read the story, I would like you to grab a piece of paper and note down maybe while in the middle of the story, the words or the sounds that may be resonant, and perhaps we can begin the conversation when the story ends with those parts. So we can begin the conversation when the story ends, which is also when the story begins. Ancestral 2020 Vision, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Part 2.
Watit, will you tell me the rest of that origin story? The one where another life begins in the future?
Right. The story of a future inhabited by peculiar beings who will call themselves humans. Thousands of years from now, in the year 2020, entities from the virus world will decimate thousands of them. Humans will be forced to flee. They will mistakenly think of the virus in the only frame they know, war. So in the first months of a rising decade in the 21st century, they will wake up and will feel as if bombs were dropped on them. as they've dropped bombs on others. With no time to pack their bags stuffed with human supremacy and the rest of their useless belongings, including belonging itself, they will lose being and becoming human.
What will those planes of existence look like, Watit?
Full of wonder and wilderness. At first, they will be afraid of what they will encounter. With no normal saint or economy god to misguide their existence, they will be swept with bewilderment. The first thing they'll realize is that they're just one more element of an endless constellation and not the center of it. Some of the cleverest ones, well, humans will not be that clever really, but some of them will smuggle their useless concept of the individual, which will have no currency in other planes. Their existence will be relational. Upon entry to these unfamiliar planes of existence, humans will disappear and become a collective of moving particles, friction, magnetism, and sonic waves, not identities, borders, or institutions will characterize their movement in the new planes. Remember that genius invention they called schools? Well, before being forced by the 2020 virus entity to flee the world as they knew it, schools were institutions. In these planes, schools will be sites of encounter. They will be located throughout and will not require a building called school for learning to take place. Because some habits are hard to die, some of them will invoke obsolete modern ideas to say schools are the best places for children to learn. But the majority of them, having learned the lessons from the 2020 pandemic, will ask, to learn what? To learn how? To learn whose knowledges? Can knowledges be owned? What counts as learning? What learning counts? Where? With what? With whom can learning take place? In the new plane of existence, they will realize that molding children into rubrics, test scores, statistics, international comparative data, and the next capitalist battalion of citizens will bring their demise. It will be the case by 2020, and it will be again after 2020. Instead of learning to become settler colonialists, at the site of encounter, children will teach and learn about colonialism and the history that forced them to seek refuge in new planes of existence. Instead of taking, children will learn to borrow and give back in full respect of the sentient beings they will be in commune with. Children will return to their wilderness without the human fear of being backward or feeling behind. That will be 2020 history. Color codes for children's bodies will no longer be the norm. In fact, there will be no norms, gender or otherwise. There will not even be children as a category upon which adults manage and attempt to control their futures. Through wandering into the histories of humankind and classificatory regimes through online or VR, they will regain a sense of humility. That will be the ultimate social and emotional learning lesson, resulting in new worlds unfolding. How marvelous.
Malchoks Watit.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. It's now, and I've just posted the link, by the way, to Licho and Gioconda's amazing book, which you really should read. Please do. Have a look at it. It's an incredible book, featuring some amazing stories. So our second speaker tonight is Victoria Ward. Victoria is an experienced strategist, coach, and speaker. After an executive career in corporate finance and operational risk, Victoria left finance in 2017. Actually, I think that's a lot longer than that. It's not 2017. I think it's 1997. Apologies. To develop her Futures and Foresight consultancy. For 25 years, she has worked at the forward edge of organisational design, visioning and strategic storytelling, transformation, knowledge management, collaboration and workplace, creating local and global narrative spaces which build momentum and meaning. She is a globally recognised knowledge management practitioner and co-developed the International Labour Organization's Knowledge Management Academy. Since 2007, she has worked with Wendy Schultz from Infinite Futures to develop and deliver Jigsaw Foresight, which includes working with interdisciplinary groups to develop and test visions and preferred futures while building foresight, fluency, and capability. Victoria, welcome.
I sound so boring compared to the people who've just spoken. I was just listening to you going, would I listen to this woman? I'm really not sure that I would. Let me put another spin on it just to give you a little bit more context before I offer you some ideas. But before I do that, I want to thank all of you, actually, for the way we've arrived at this moment in the session. Philippa, I want to thank you for the quotes. The quotes created a space for us to arrive in together and for us to breathe together a little bit differently. And that's one of the challenges I spend a lot of time on, is actually how do you make place virtually? How do you make place and meaningful emotional connection virtually? And I felt you invited us in there. And then the sounds and the stories and the words of our first two speakers did something else to pull us deeper into a space. And I guess I want to try and link what I'm going to say to you with why I got into knowledge management in late 1997. Because I think my lands, the lands I work in, are actually the lands inside these corporations, which don't make place and don't make belonging and don't necessarily prize the ancestors. They often push the ancestors out of the way. So I think my territory that I could offer to you is how to stop organisations creating a kind of dispossessing certain voices and prizing other voices. Equalising the storytelling in corporate settings is really why I got into knowledge management, because I saw that the junior and middle levels of the organisation, where its licence to operate actually lived, didn't have the same voices as the people at senior levels, or who were apparently the people who made money. So I think that question of witnessing all voices and creating equality for all voices, I do it within that organisational context, and I'll try and draw those links. And I will also spend a little bit more time in thinking about how we restory the past in organisations in order to make plural futures possible. So I hope I won't talk in too unhelpfully jargony ways, but those are the connections I was making when I was listening, and please stop me if I drift off into the world of corporate speak. I don't intend to, because my job, as I see it, is to create poetry and poetic spaces and restored spaces in the work that Wendy and I do together. And I bring often restoring the past, and I connect it with Wendy's ways of restoring the future. And we find that to be a very fruitful combination, because both seem to us to be of equal importance. And I wanted to pick up a couple of things that our former speakers both said and did. Firstly, to give us a soundscape was beautiful, as a way, again, of making a place for us to be in together with all of our faculties. And I wanted to just pick out a couple of things that they said that seemed to me to chime with what I do, which is chronological time. I wrote it down as chronological time reinforces the status quo, but the kind of the monologue of chronicle time and working only in chronicle time seems to me to be a very destructive force And I also notice in the organisations I work with an intense leaning forward into an imaginary future chronological time without thought for imagination, without thought for the stories of the present, without thought for what you want to carry forward from the past and what you need to leave behind. So these are often the challenges we're working with under the label of some project or another in organisations. So I just wanted to give that context. And then I have, where have they gone? What have I got? Yeah, I've got a few kind of slides here to help us. Philippa, you may have to help me make connections, Oliver, the other speakers, because I am speaking from a different world. So Wendy and I thought about this as thinking about storytelling in the context we work in as seed pods on the winds of change. So how do you create a different way of working with stories from our pasts, presents and futures so that we pluralise and treasure and plant and garden together rather than there being a dominant discourse? A sort of colonisation is the word you've been using. So one piece of work that I did, was with the Islamic Development Bank in 2000 and something, where it was supposed to be a knowledge management piece, but we also did an oral history piece with the founding brothers in order to create a way to transmit stories of the founding of the bank to the future people who would be leading it. And that was very interesting because the founding brothers, as they all were, weren't used to being listened to, and they weren't being used to being listened to for themselves, but they weren't used to being listened to for their whole selves. They were used to being listened to as senior people. And one of them, I thought, said something very beautiful. As I'm the first to be interviewed, I would like to say a few words. I want to try and avoid being like the grandfather that I am, telling fairy tales that will all have happy endings. I want to try to avoid giving advice or rulings. And I thought, as an ancestor in that organisation, I would share that with you, because I thought he was so wise to want to share things, but we also looked at creating listening in the next generations to the ancestors in that setting. And that wasn't straightforward. We had to find a way of disentangling and finding the smaller stories rather than the relatively rehearsed ones, the ones with meaning, not the ones that have been kind of baked into the formal structures. And I think I'll skip over the next thing, but this is where Wendy got the metaphor of gardening from. This is a piece of work we did to find the stories of how do you make change happen in the Department of the Environment. And again, we had to dig down behind the official stories of how do you make change happen and find the roots, the behind the scenes, the stories that nobody ever tells because they're not appropriate or allowed. So, for example, in some of the stories that people told, a big theme about making spaces for change and for new stories to come in, fueled by Foresight, these policymakers talked a lot about making room for discomfort. And I think that perhaps is a theme that would be consistent, is how do you be willing in a very knowledgeable organisation not to know? How do you be willing to park your subject matter expertise and your knowledges that you've worked hard for, your professional knowledge, and make room for the knowledge from experience, the knowledge from others, the knowledge from junior people? And that's really what you see in the roots of this picture, is lots of stories about the kinds of knowledges that often just run around in the corridors of organisations but aren't given space to take root and be part of the more formal spaces, that kind of semi-formal stories and knowledge is often stays personal and private rather than becoming collective. And then I thought perhaps, thinking about stories of our presence and the gardens we tend today, I thought you might be interested in a piece of work that we did with the Asian Development Bank in about 2009. We ended up, the book's online actually, you can see it, and there's a methodology piece at the back. But I want to do a little bit of a detour where they were very interested in creating a better storytelling organisation, a better multicultural, multinational, multi-story culture. and using the richness of those stories to help them with their move to the future while prizing the past. And I just wanted to pick out a couple of things from that work. One of which is we audited what they called their impact stories, which was their stories of demonstrating their value as an organisation. And there was something very interesting in that audit, which was they would often take Greek myths, Greek mythical figures and metaphors, or Western fair stories or whatever, and use those as a way to talk about, I don't know, something like microfinance. And we questioned that. We said, why would this way of telling stories be appropriate in your Asian context? Why are you not using stories from your own folklore and cultures in your 57 countries? Why are you reaching back into a shorthand that has no real meaning and relevance in the stories that you want to tell as an organisation today? And that was an insight they came to. And I thought that was a really important thing to think about, is who were the translators in these settings, and are they calling on a different knowledge that's not relevant? And that also fed into how we designed the artifacts that we made. But we also did recordings, and we made, this is also on SoundCloud, a soundscape of the organisation, which was also what it sounds like, what the footsteps sounds like, what their projects sound like, and pieces of our interviews. And we did things with that. For example, we told the story of the tsunami through the story of a locally employed, which is always a status thing, Filipino help desk worker. Told the story of keeping things going during the tsunami so that all of the beneficiaries of the Asian Development Bank could benefit. So we thought that that was actually very valuable, to find a very small story of everyday story that actually had a profound effect and give a different voice space in these soundscapes. And that was my favourite track from it, because constantly looking for different witnessing and different stories and people whose voices don't normally get heard, being heard and being part of the constellation of stories, and giving them in turn, giving other people ordinary everyday voices meaning rather than the normal voices. I wanted to refer to, I'm sure you've all seen this, but I wanted to talk a bit here about what you also spoke about pluralising. There's a brilliant TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie about the dangers of the single story. And I think that's what the last speakers were talking about absolutely necessary to pluralise, create polyphony, not shrink things into one shrink-wrapped diamond of a story that actually kind of edits out all of the people who made it. So one thing I would offer you from our Foresight work is we've more and more used postcards. I've got an article I'll put the link to about postcards as doorways to the future that talks about the value of this. It's a slightly old-fashioned, perhaps from my British childhood idea, but the idea of a postcard is that it has an image on it. It has a few words that one person has written personally from their own experience, and it's sent to another person. It's a very small unit of communication. And we've used postcards to help people collect postcards from the past and imagine postcards from the future. So they become very personal and very individual. And that also means that my personal story can count in the future. So we've got lots of examples of how to, with Andrew Curry, who's done a lot of work on this as well, think about small images from the future that you can accompany with small personal stories and build them into patterns of the future that are polyphonic, multi-voiced, rather than just one little block of a scenario from the future. And that seems to be a very valuable way of making spaces for the future. All of these things I could talk about a lot more, but I don't know that that would add very much to this overall conversation. But I want to come back to where you started. There's a lovely recent article in the Wall Street Journal, about storytelling, the importance of storytelling, making hearts beat as one. And I think that's what you all did at the beginning of this session. And I think that's what we're seeking to do, is to create a kind of hearts beating as one in our presents and our futures. I don't think I have anything else that I can say right now that will add something. So I hope that has added something to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Victoria. And lastly, we have Ollie, who's our third speaker for tonight. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ollie Kotsaftis. Ollie is a post-disciplinary designer navigating the spaces between presents, futures, fictions, and realities. At RMIT University School of Design, his research addresses climate resilience and social innovation in urban heterotopias. He is also the founder and creative director of Future Ensemble Studio and the co-founder of Speculative Futures Melbourne, which is the Melbourne chapter of the Design Futures Initiative. So over to you, Ollie.
Thanks, Philippa. So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and somehow it's also like a great coincidence because just this week, a few days ago, there's a brilliant academic named Laura Folarno that published an essay called "The Future is Not a Solution," which I believe is a must-read for everyone interested in the topic of futures. And in this essay, Laura touches base on a lot of key concepts, but one of the main talking points for me is that really that notion that futures cannot be predicted, but rather are an invitation to think about who we want to be. And when we start thinking about futures this way, something which is not a solution to our current problems, but rather an introspection about who we are as a society and who we want to become, then the practice of futuring becomes a lot more generative and a lot more creative as well. But no matter how we think about futures, I think it's always important to start with an understanding of the status quo, an understanding about the current reality of the now. So there you go. At this stage, we all know it already. We are living in a human-made climate, environmental, and social emergency. And I'm not going to expand on the what, but whether we like it or not, the global impact of climate change, environmental destruction, and social inequalities are becoming more and more visible. And if you ask the youth, the results are actually quite concerning. In the largest and most international survey of young people to date, a new piece of research is showing that nearly 60% of the global youth feels very or extremely worried about climate change, and over 45% of them say that their feelings about the climate negatively affect their daily lives. So the big question is what's happening? Why are we reaching a point in time where our ways of life that have supported us for so long are now playing against us? And I'm sure there's many explanations to these questions, but after spending quite a bit of time thinking about this myself, one of my key messages is that, I'm not sure why the slide is not changing. It's going to happen. There we go. We are living in the dreams of the powerful of the past. The problems is that these dreams that have been materialized into the society we currently live in are not even questioned anymore. And these dreams and societies are no longer adapted to the realities of our contemporary world. So if we look at cities, for example, and the way they are built, despite some variations in form, most large-scale urban development today are composed of glass skyscraper that are highly unsustainable, that use way too many resources, and that are only accentuating social inequalities. So Hudson Yard in New York City, which is the development that you can see in the image on screen right now, is the perfect example of that. And that's the case study that a lot of people would have heard of. But the strategy and aesthetic of building are completely disconnected from place and culture, and are being used all over the world. So to prove my point, like in Melbourne, and this is just an image of the two buildings next to each other, which are the headquarters of two financial institutions side by side. And the only difference between these two buildings is that the one on the left was built nearly 50 years ago, and the one on the right was completed last month. And in my opinion, both these buildings are soulless, devoid of any cultural relevance associated with place, and both are highly unsustainable. So at this stage, I'd like to talk about the concept of sustainability itself. Sustainability is currently understood as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the definition dates from 1987. And the problem, in my opinion, with this definition is that it is positioning the notion of sustainability in a human-centric value extraction framework. What the definition is saying, basically, we only need to care for the planet and maintain our own way of living. And don't get me wrong, I think the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations that you can see on screen as well are fantastic. But I find this conversation on sustainability a way to focus on the goals to be achieved rather than being a value-based conversation. And at the end of the day, what we really should think about is our journey towards sustainability rather than achieving sustainability itself. So let's look at the classic triple bottom line sustainability frameworks, for example. So you might have seen the Venn diagram on the left, maybe it's also the nested model on the right. But either or, these frameworks have been designed to show that sustainability is only achieved when we consider the economic, the social, and the environmental systems. But here we need to be a bit real. These three pillars of sustainability are not often considered equal and are most often considered independently. As a result of which, sustainable projects are mostly assessed based on their return on investment, or at best from a human-centered perspective. So here we are in 2021 with a genuine desire to make things better, yet we are still anchored in a socioeconomic model that we've inherited from our ancestors, the shareholder capitalistic model, and this model has shaped the world we currently live in. So here, I'd like to bring an iteration of my earlier one-liner. If the world we live in is the product of the dreams of the powerful of the past, well, the world of tomorrow should be the result of the dreams of the powerful of the now. And the big question is like, whose dreams are we going to live into? Who gets to future for us all, basically? And unfortunately for us today, the world is pretty much run by tech companies. And if we include tech as the primary driver or the center of the models we've discussed before, we'll most likely end up living in a Techno Utopia, in a world which is shaped by tech and where tech is the solution to every problem we encounter. So in the next slide, I put like an image of almost a stereotypical image of a Techno Utopia. And this is the first image that appears on a Google search if you type Techno Utopia. And what you can see here is a supposedly ideal world where a young, able, fit, white guy has an extendable bionic arm instead of an extendable leash to walk his robot dog. And what this image is telling us, and the narrative about Techno Utopia, is that the future is white, that the future is male, that the future is technological, and that the future is following this idea of perfection, which we know is a complete fallacy. So the real question here is like, is that what we really want? Like, because when we look at what's published out there and what people discuss, like from autonomous cars to artificial intelligence and carbon scrubbing devices, the whole conversation about future seems to be centered on technology as a solution to everything. And we're basically denying the organic nature of the world we live in. So my personal belief is that we must reconnect with the natural systems that support our existence. And I made that simple sentence the core of my design practice, which is also the reason why I use this image when I do public speaking nowadays, to kind of like let the human in the backdrop a bit and let nature take center stage a bit. So what that means, if we start seeing technology as an enabler of a multifaceted systemic solution rather than the solution itself, well, everything changes. Desirable solutions should, for the future and the now, should obviously include the economic, social, and environmental components that we've talked about before, but they should also take into account place and culture. Future should be contextual rather than universal. And because we only have a limited amount of time to address the human-made climate, environmental, and social emergency we are really living in, we should start talking about alternative presence, or heterotopia, which is also the core of my practice, rather than utopian futures. So, trying to change slides again. There we go. If we go one step further, when talking about culture, we should talk about the pluriversality of the contemporary world. And it's something that all speakers tonight have been touched base on. The world is obviously composed of multiple ethnicity, but it's also non-binary, which is something that seems to be forgotten quite a lot when we look at how the world is currently designed. And when we talk about the environment and society, we should stop designing for the benefit of the human race alone. What we should start realizing is that we are living in a tightly controlled closed loop system, and that each and every single species that exists on this planet has a role to play in the balance of our global ecosystems. So when we deregulate the biological system that govern our world, through deforestation, for example, or intensive agriculture, we end up in situations like the viral pandemic we are currently living in since the start of last year. So instead of an environmental and social future, new words are emerging, such as regenerative and equitable futures. And my belief is that we should combine all this thinking together to design human-centered, more than human alternative presence, rather than human-centered technological futures. So I'll be more than happy to show you what that means in practice, but I think I've spoken for quite a bit now, so I can leave that for question time. But just to finish, I'd like to quote an associate professor from the UK, Christopher Barnett, that says the only way we can actually preserve things for the future and look after the environment is to change how we live, to use fewer resources, and to value things in another way. Or to paraphrase what I was talking about at the start, we should think about futures as an introspection about who we are as a society and who we want to become, rather than a solution-focused practice. So I'm going to stop here and we can start the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ali. I really hope everyone enjoyed those amazing talks, 3 very, very rich discussions. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into the questions. So I'm going to start with quite a broad question, which actually came from Tanya at the very, very start, which I think Victoria answered in part, which was about how do we make space for the voices of others? How do we make our stories collective without fear of consequences? And I know that Victoria started to answer that in the chat, but I also know that all of the speakers have been talking about this today. And I just wanted to check in with all of you to get your additional insights on that question. So I might start with Licho and Gioconda, if that's okay.
Sure. I don't know. I don't know about this sort of agentic positioning of us to allow others to do the work. It seems that there's already in that geometry and imbalance. And I wonder if the question to ask is, how can we enable ourselves to hear what people are already saying? Or how can we develop? I don't have the words to do this without falling into the very terms that the story interrogates. But how do we train ourselves to sense what people are communicating in the streets, in the classrooms, online, when we are asleep? There are multiple places where people are already not only voicing, but sending messages out there, out here, in here. And so it is a matter of trying to figure out how it is that we can attune ourselves to those messages so that we can be receptive and responsive and not at that point reinstate the unequal geometry, but then to be in solidarity with people and joining their causes, and not as allies, but as co-conspirators of us having the possibility of giving up the privileges and the access to the future that some of us have already guaranteed, depending on how our bodies showed up in this world, to make room, that the room that has been taken away from people in places like Australia or Abiayala and others around the world. I don't know if Gio wanted to add anything.
Yeah, maybe add. I guess I'm thinking as you're speaking, Licho, and I'm agreeing with you. I'm nodding, and also thinking about the idea of people that Quechua people have, which is, there's this word runa, which means a being, right? It means people, but you can also have tree people and forest people and river people, which are, when I say tree people, they're the trees, right? And so there's stories there in the forest, by the trees, by the animals, by the river, which are also being told. And I was hearing this talk yesterday on Quechua and Quechua speakers, and one of them was saying, like, our elders have been in complicity with the forest and with the people from the underworld, and like talking to be able to have knowledge and to be able to know and to go about life. And we're at risk of like disconnecting from those stories. And so I think is that, right? Part of that listening to people needs to be, of course, I think, diverse in all senses, including beings that are also talking from other planes of existence to connect to the story that we were telling.
Beautiful. Thank you both. Ollie, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Sure. I think it's a fantastic question. And Licho, you nailed it straight away. Like, the voices are everywhere already. They're everywhere in pop culture, on TikTok, on Reels. People are expressing themselves every day, but they are not heard. How is this happening? So it's really about, like, if we want to bring like a diversity, like, obviously, like, there's the obvious thing that everybody does, which is about bringing diversity into like boards and panels and all of this. But also, like, in design, if I bring it back to design, it's also very important to have like design teams that are diverse and that represent the people that are that the design team is designing for. If I take the hat of the speculative, more than human designer, the next question is, like, how do we give a voice to people that cannot speak, which is the non-human species that are around us? How do we care for, like, all species that exist on this planet from bacteria to amoebas to mammals, and care for the needs as well. So it's a very, very long, it's a very big question that have a lot of answers, but there's a lot of opportunities for design.
Thank you. Philippa, could I just add a couple of things to that? Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
One is to build on both all three of the last responses, and one is kind of intensely personal, but has come to mind. So the first thing is, I think I want to come back to this question of multidisciplinarity and many voices and education. I think it comes into our education systems, not just primary, but in the Western world. Well, I don't know. I can only talk about my own British and European experience. But the fact is, we default to prizing certain types of knowledge, scientific, professional, more than operational experience or creative knowledge. And we don't prize those knowledges, and we don't prize the knowledges of people who don't know how to articulate their experiences on the same level of those who are articulate. So I'm only talking about the human world here, but I think that extends to the non-human as well. There's a job of work to be done, which some things like appreciative inquiry do quite well, to reverse the existing power structures, to find a way to bring voices in. And I do think certain foresight tools and techniques and the playfulness of foresight and the visualization of foresight can really help with that. The thing from the future, 3 horizons, whatever else. And actually, Wendy's got a lovely bank of trickster cards. So you can throw different voices in safely by having different people speak from different points of view. So you can, and I think that multidisciplinarity and equal knowledges is really important. And I want to say the second thing, and I feel a bit unsafe saying it, but I'm going to go with it. So, this is about my ancestors, and this is about colonialization. So I was born in Kiribati. So I am in a sense of Oceania. And I was born in Kiribati because my parents, my ancestors, who made me who I am, were part in that day of the British colonial service. They feel utterly unable to talk to anyone about that. So they cannot be respected as ancestors in our discourse because of the label of colonialisation. So when we talk about all voices, and I find myself quite tearful saying this, my parents have a voice too, but they feel muffled. So I just want to point out that there are things to do with maybe truth and reconciliation, or not just disrespecting the old white voices. They're old white people, they're old white middle class people. Their voice needs room too. And they need to also listen, which they can't do as well as they might because they don't feel listened to. So this comes back to my witnessing point. Thank you for giving me room to say that.
No, you're fine, Victoria. It's a safe space here. So everyone needs to share their thoughts. Colonialism is, of course, a really, really important part of this discussion also. And I've actually just come from a talk with Tyson Young-Porter and Norm Sheehan about this very topic, about colonialism and its place and effect on education. So I'm going to take the host's prerogative and ask one of my burning questions that doesn't really relate to colonialism or colonialization quite so much, but more about the making of futures and what you speak about in your book, Licho and Gio. And it's around anticipation, because I was really struck by what you term anticipatory regimes, which of course I suppose is an act of colonization. It's an act of configuring and taking control of bodies and selves. And I'm just really curious. I'd love you to explain that concept of, that of being, that is anticipation of being, out of sync. And I don't even have the quotes you use are really, really, the way you phrase it is quite beautiful. So I'm going to just read it. It's a very, very small section if I can find it. Which is that anticipation abides in the ontology of the not yet. So anticipation requires orientation of the self to inhabit time out of place by knowing that which has not yet become. So I'd love to invite you both to say a little bit more about that, and then for Ollie and Victoria to, to speak a little bit more about the role anticipation plays in both of your disciplines.
I think, and then Licho, you can jump in whenever. But this idea of inhabiting out of place is precisely that, right? It's like that sort of ungrounding of time, and just thinking about time as if it wasn't connected to land, as if it wasn't part of it. And that's a very particular way of thinking about time that is really not shared by every culture in the world. That's one thing. But then the other thing is, like, can we think about, and when we think about like anticipation and anticipation studies that have been sort of thinking about that, like, how can we imagine the future? How can we think about the future and bring it to the present, or the critique to it? But then, can we think future differently? And can we think it groundedly? And can we then listen as well? And I would push back to what Oli was saying of these beings that don't talk, because that's also a very particular cultural notion, that the earth doesn't talk, that the beings of the earth don't talk, or they don't communicate. And then just to think about how that time space, we could say from Quechua perspective, that pacha, that is both things, and it's not one or the other. How can that be a principle of hope and that anticipation, in that sense of like something that we haven't engaged with, something that has not happened yet, right? Like in that sense, we haven't engaged with it. It's a story that is there, or that is vibrating, or that might have different sort of a certain existence that we haven't engaged with, but that can be grounded not only because it's part of it can, like, it's part maybe of how it takes place, how it becomes something we can engage with, or is part of what it is. But as well, because it is also always sort of place. How can you think about time without thinking about the beings, the land, where that time sort of emerges and also becomes storied? And I hope that wasn't like too hard to follow. And I don't know if Licho wants to add anything.
Just wanted to maybe add something that connects to one of the points that someone made in the chat, that is sort of in many ways sort of circular to what we were saying earlier. And I guess in many ways also to stress what Gioconda is saying there about the more than human being enabled to speak, which again is sort of a logocentric way, Euro modern way of thinking about, again, space and the earth. When I was living and sharing space with some of what are now my families in northern Guatemala, on the border with Mexico, one of the things that these communities who are connected to land and who do listen to and sense the territory in a different way, they insisted that the land was tired. And it was tired because of agro businesses. And so it connects to the question about how to bring this to businesses. indigenous communities in several places are telling us the land's not able to do the work to care for us and for us to care for them if we don't allow the space. And so after so many times and the repetition of time of that exploitation, all the land is telling us in that space is that it is tired. And so we ought to listen to that, to be able to create other anticipations that are not the same ones that we are able to imagine now or to experience now, at least not the we that are here. That is not the same we that is in other in other geographies where the more than human are actually being sensed and are being heard and are being seen.
Amazing. Thank you both. Ollie, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Like this notion of anticipation is kind of a funny topic for me because as a speculative designer, I actually don't project into futures at all. I try to think about how we could think about the world differently today. And I think like when you look at like the generic discourse about future, is always about like utopia versus dystopia and what world do we want to live in and what's terrible for us. But like there's many presents that exist based on our different realities, and I think we should look into that already and try to like emulate different vision of the world right now rather than always projecting about how they're going to become later. So like this notion of anticipation, I think would be absent from my practice, as I'd rather to like live in the realm of today.
Interesting. I think speculative futures, we do quite a lot of work in speculative futures, but always bring people back to today. And I very much liked your thing, Ollie, about alternative futures. What was going through my mind when you said the land is tired? The land is tired. That's a beautiful and poetic way to say it. And what scientists need a bridge to translate it into their context. So there's something about being able to translate between the poetry and the storytelling language and the technical languages that people feel safe in and the technical solutions people feel safe in. And the danger is everyone attaches themselves to a faith system which makes their language right. So the language of technology is my faith and I'm sticking with it, or the language of poetry is what I believe in, so I'm not listening to your language. What I think that we do in Foresight with some of the tools is give people enough emotional grounding that they can give themselves permission to play with speculative, well, not speculative, that's your word, with alternative futures and imagine what they feel like to be inhabited and let go of what they must hold on to as their value system. So one of the things that is great about using Foresight intentionally is you give people permission to park their status, park their value systems, and engage together in playing with what the future might look and feel like if it were inhabited. But even then, you have to do a lot of work with that. There's one piece of work where we have a very senior panel who are full of status in their world, and when we take them to these alternative futures, they say, but that's like bad science fiction written by undergraduates, because they're trying to defend themselves from the emotional engagement. So I suppose the idea is to create emotional engagement and keep people safe in that. And there's a real role in that because you actually fire up similar parts of the brain with future emotions about the future as you do remembering the past, I think the brain science says. So it's about creating emotionally inhabited spaces that you can have that future conversation in, not just shiny scenarios, which are just another technology, I think.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm just trying to pick up on some questions. There's one about technology that keeps popping up. I think everyone really found Ollie's discussion about technology as not being the answer, but playing more of an enabling role as a really interesting thing to explore. So, and one of the comments is that the push towards technology is of course growing stronger, and sometimes it feels like it is dominating, the natural systems, to the detriment of us and to our planet. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on a suitable safeguards. I might start I'll start with Ollie actually this time, just in case he wants to add anything more to what he discussed. And maybe you can talk about your practice as well if you want, the examples that you didn't mention in your discussion, Ollie.
For sure. It's a conversation that I had a lot with my students at MIT University. I actually teach in the Master of Design, Innovation and Technology, but we talk a lot about what is technology to start with. It doesn't have to be like, technology as we understand it today, which is computers and digital world and all of that. But there's many forms of technology to start with. But like the narrative around technology is really focused on that high tech. The language is a technology, and it's a great one. And also you have the biotechs, which are obviously from part of my practice. And I think no matter what technology we're talking about, is like the role of a designer or like a speculative futurist is really to like assess which technology will enable the best solution to occur and generate a lot of value for everybody involved, rather than like proposing and asserting technology, no matter what form, again, as the solution and the driver of the solution. A classic example, which is known by everybody, the guy who invented the like button on Facebook didn't realize that there was going so many like social consequences around this very simple design, and it kind of like excused, apologized after realizing the impact that this simple design could have on the world. And when you start looking at your daily life, there's like so many technological solutions that do not need to be there. I spend quite a bit of time like browsing different sources of news every day, and I get bombarded by like everybody by the commercial. But like I think one today really like struck me was as completely useless. Is like a rising desk that needs to be pushed by a button to rise by 20 centimeter high. Why do we need this? Why do we have to spend energy and thus carbon in order to rise the desk by 20 centimeters when we can just like potentially lift it up and have a mechanical solution to that? So that I'm going to leave it like that, and maybe other people from the panel can jump in.
Perhaps, I guess it's also. I'm thinking while I'm talking with you, so I hope it's okay. Sometimes we think about technology, and also that has a particular imagination about what technology is and how is it used. And when we were doing the launch event with Licho for the book, we had this question as well about like, how do we think about Indigenous people and technology? And of course, the assumption was that indigeneity and technology didn't go together in the discourse, right? And so we're challenging that, not only because of all the different kinds of technology that we can think of that are not, they're not maybe these futuristic, are not part of that futuristic or dystopia sort of imaginations, but also in how different ways that, as I was saying at some point, like technology in the present, how is it being used to expand the stories or to be able to communicate and beyond the voice and beyond the letters, and also maybe even beyond sound itself, but how different art, different provocations that come from technology can add to that storytelling. And I'm going to stop there because I'm kind of still thinking about this, and maybe Licho wants to.
I'm happy for Victoria to go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say something that I really wanted to build on that. I think the kind of technology as the solution, dangerous thing, is as dangerous as saying let's all have micro-mindfulness practices in organisations and that will sort out our well-being. It's a dangerous, slippy kind of commodification of actually deep concepts. So I think the danger is in the commodification and the speed of solutions, and that's in danger of undoing an idea which actually has really sound possibilities. And I agree very much with both of you. I think technology used widely can actually diversify voices. Things like Dave Snowden's SenseMaker allows everybody to engage with it with small stories of first-hand ideas, first-hand experience, and then those things are patterned up, but actually it creates incredible access. And it can be done technologically or done analog and put into the technology. You've actually got mass ways of collecting small stories and bringing all kinds of stories into things if you use technology to empower people in that way. So I think we're in danger of pigeonholing everything if we constantly work at the surface of what's quick and commodifiable rather than going, what are the deep, long, slow values that inform this? And I think that's partly where the problem is those tensions in timescales, is we're ripping the fast layer away from the longer, slower layers, and we are ungrounding ourselves, to use a term you've used earlier. But what we need to do is stitch that fast layer back in and use it wisely to gain access to and shift the longer, slower layers of values and belief systems and time and space and all the rest of it. We're operating in a very fragmented way.
Licho, did you want to add any further comments to that? Or are you all good? Fantastic. I know that I have many more questions I'd love to ask you, and I'm sure the panel, the audience would too, but we have come to time, unfortunately, and I don't want to take up too much of your valuable evening or morning for you, Victoria. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But as I mentioned at the start, I really recommend that you read Licho and Gioconda's wonderful book. Please explore Ollie's work and also look into Victoria's website, because she has some wonderful tools and resources that you can look at and explore. And I think Victoria's also posted her email in the chat, so feel free to reach out to her as well if you want to follow up on any of the comments that she's made and you want to talk to her further about her practice. So I'm just going to say a tremendous thank you to our wonderful, wonderful speakers today. This has been an amazing discussion, and I'm sure it's left everyone, definitely me, with a lot to think about. If you want to unmute to say a final goodbye, just to connect each other across time and space and geography, please feel free to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone. Wonderful. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.